The Russian-Ukraine war is the current Cuban Missile Crisis of today. In this podcast, learn how overly pessimistic perceptions about the intentions of potential opponents tends to become self-fulfilling prophecies. In this podcast, we ask how the United States would react if the shoe were on the other foot. That is, if Russia acted towards the United States as the West has acted towards Russia. What were the implications for Russian security of the American withdrawal from the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Missile Treaty? Didn't U.S. foreign policy experts publicly warn that NATO expansion would lead to disaster? Why are those responsible for NATO's failed expansion policy now doubling down on their mistakes? Did provocations place Russia in an untenable situation for which war seemed to Putin and his military staff the only workable solution? In the end, who bears primary responsibility for the ongoing disaster in Ukraine? Find out on Emir Phillips' American Pragmatist.
Ignoring all of the remedies, believing all of the rumors, with their endless database. I wanna sit with my enemies and say we should have done this sooner, while I look them in the face. Maybe that will crack the case.
All right, Mir, good to see you. We have a big topic, one that's been very prevalent in the news. It seems for eternity at this point. So let me know, why did you call me here to talk about, Ukraine and Russia? What's going on?
There's a gross misunderstanding in mainstream media, and I wanted the podcast to clarify that misunderstanding. The West, the collective West, it's now basing existential decisions on false premises. And practically what it means is it's deepening the crisis in the Russian-Ukraine war that I believe is sleepwalking the West and the world, specifically the United States, into arguably or possibly a nuclear war. I think we're at this point today closer to a nuclear war than we were in the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, the mainstream media, their narrative has shifted, I think, a bit. I'm becoming more and more concerned, just like you, about the possibility of nuclear war, or at least an expanding war, because right now it seems it's just Ukraine and Russia, but the United States more involved, Poland a little bit more involved. It's becoming a little more concerning.
All right, before we get on to me, then I want to hear, what's your perception overall of this shift?
I guess in the months since Russia first invaded Ukraine, the explanation, often from a more American involvement standpoint of point of view right there, that has changed. American involvement has changed. What had been pitched as, a limited sort of humanitarian effort, hoorah, let's go save them, to help Ukraine defend itself, that has morphed into, how do I want to put this? It's just kind of included more of let's decimate Russia. Let's kind of degrade their capacity to fight another war in the future. That's what it kind of seems like is going on.
Yeah, I would argue that strategic objective you've alluded to may very well have been in place from the start. In March, more than a month before the new U.S. policy was announced, Chas Freeman, previously Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, observed, and I quote, "Everything we are doing, rather than accelerating an end to the fighting and achieving some compromise, seems to be aimed at prolonging the fighting, assisting the Ukrainian resistance, which is a noble cause, I suppose, but will result in a lot of dead Ukrainians as well as dead Russians." And I want to put up, right now, a good article that discusses this issue, and then hopefully our readers can look at that at their leisure.
I read that article, you gave it to me and I took a look at it. But I think Freeman's observation, his points, it kind of leads to an uncomfortable truth. America has two war aims here, and they're not really compatible with each other, I would say.
Yeah, I would concur. Whereas a humanitarian effort would seek to limit the destruction and end the war quickly, The strategic goal of weakening Russia, as you said, degrade Russia and then humiliate Russia, I would believe that's implied, requires a prolonged war with maximum destruction, which seems to be where we're headed.
Yeah.
One that bleeds Russia dry of men and machines from the battlefield of Ukraine. And I think we're on the precipice of that right now. And when the ground freezes, Levi, for 2 weeks, Russia can begin an offensive in Bakhmut, and we're going to see an actualization of what you and I are alluding to right now.
Yeah, I just can't but think that like the internal contradiction will eventually work itself out, as all things do. It'll come to an end, but it seems like we're headed towards like an ugly end with this one. Personally, it really does.
I mean, ugly enough to where I think we can now start rightfully having a conversation about EMP strikes and tactical nukes in Ukraine. But to come back to Freeman, he captures the contradiction you're alluding to quite well in a darkly ironic quip. He says, "We will fight to the last Ukrainian for Ukrainian independence." And I think that's well said.
Yeah, it seems undeniable, like at this point, that America's new military objective, and it places the U.S. into a very interesting, perception. What I'm trying to say is like more position, rather, in direct confrontation with Russia. The goal is to cripple part of their state, specifically the military, and that seems more at the forefront than, like, let's save Ukraine.
I agree. To that specific end, since the start of the war, the Biden administration and Congress have allocated now $130 billion in aid for Ukraine. The majority of it military. How much of it ends up in the Ukraine and how much of it goes to the deep state, military contractors, who knows? I know Ron Paul asked for an inspector general recently to verify a legitimate accounting of the money, to have transparency of the money so the American people can see what's being spent, which is double the entire Russian military budget, which I believe is about $60 billion a year. We've given double that to the Ukrainians now. And Ron Paul, of course, lost, unfortunately, in asking for an inspector general to monitor the money. But U.S. officials have revealed that American intelligence enabled the killing of a dozen Russian generals in Ukraine in this fighting so far. The sinking of the Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, which killed 40 sailors and wounded 100. So the aid has been effective to a certain degree. Is it prolonging the fight? Will it lead to victory? I don't know, but it's certainly bringing us to the precipice of this war going at a whole new level.
Yeah, equally alarming to me is the fact that the EU is so completely fallen in line. They greatly increasing, not just the number, but the lethality of the weapons they're shipping to Ukraine. British leaders have sought to expand the battlefield for a while, openly encouraging, Ukrainian soldiers to use Western weapons to attack supply lines inside Russia. The Patriot missiles and all that. It just keeps ramping up.
There already have been attacks within Russia. One attacked an airport that had nuclear weaponry within 2 miles, and the attack came from within Russia. I'm assuming was carried out by special forces, whether Ukrainian, probably unlikely, more likely British special forces, which we believe now blew up the bridge in near Sevastopol in the Crimea. That seems to have been a British op. So British special forces and American special forces, I think, probably have been in Russia, certainly high probability in the Crimean. And, we can debate or not, but I certainly think the U.S. destroyed the Nordic Stream. But unfortunately, it gets worse than that. On February 27th, 3 days after the Russian invasion began, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that in response to aggressive statements from Western leaders, he raised the alert status of Russia's nuclear forces. Then in May, a close media associate of Putin warned the British Prime Minister that his statements and actions risk subjecting England to a radioactive tsunami from one of Russia's land attack nuclear torpedoes. This and other Russian warnings about nuclear war have been dismissed by most of the Western media as mere propaganda. Yet, this is critical, within 24 hours of Putin's February 27th announcement, the U.S. military raised its alert status to DEFCON 3 for the first time since 9/11. The result is that both countries are closer to a hair-trigger launch policy right now, thereby increasing the chance that an accident, political miscalculation, or computer error could lead to a nuclear exchange, which obviously could lead to the end of planet Earth.
Yeah, and I guess this is the biggest thing that kind of hit me when I was just thinking through everything, because you have to consider what would happen if Russia started to lose this war. Just imagine, their overall military capacity, it's just degraded to a point where now Moscow, like they're now like on their heels. They perceive an actual threat. I can't imagine what they might do should that actually come about.
Just to be clear, I think all things the way they are right now, by August, September, I think Russia is either winning the war, have won the war. However, if we keep up in the ante and doubling billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars of port in the Ukraine, I cannot deny that increases the chances of Russia losing the war, or putting in a position where Russia perceives they're going to lose the war. And in that situation, Russian planners would, I believe, surely contemplate using low yield battlefield nuclear weapons to destroy enemy forces, or I believe much, much more likely an EMP strike, electromagnetic pulse strike, breaking the energy grid, since that's been a key component of the military objective of Russia. If they can break the energy grid and thereby reduce Ukraine's ability to defend itself, reduce it. So unless the situation were escalating at an exponential rate, I believe it's much more likely the Russians are going to use an EMP, and that's electromagnetic pulse, which I haven't podcast on that as an aside, in the Ukraine and possibly elsewhere. If the Russians use a nuke, I believe it would be tactical and only in the Ukraine, thereby not necessarily necessitating a U.S. nuclear response.
Yeah, and I get that. I mean, I just can't escape the fact that, like if Russia did use nuclear weapons, the pressure for a Western nuclear response, I feel like it amps up, and it, followed by further escalation of a just an increasingly growing conflict. But that situation, in that situation, I would think that Russian loss and depletion, that's exactly what the U.S. is looking for. They kind of want it to go, those dominoes kind of fall in that way. That's what they're seeking to achieve.
Well, I mean, the name they keep saying, Zelensky, is regime change. Remember, at this point, the Russians have consistently been willing to negotiate. It is the U.S., the West, NATO, and Zelensky who refuse to negotiate unless apparently the evil, crazy Putin is removed, which isn't going to happen. And frankly, if he was removed, someone might be worse. But you got to ask, what would happen if the war dragged on to where, opposition to Putin led to his removal? Well, we can discuss that possibility because that seems to be the agenda of Zelensky and President Biden. So you're talking about this regime change, which in the U.S. is backed, by an informal alliance of Republican neoconservatives, Mitt Romney, Murkowski, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, so on and so forth. Republicans call them rhino Republicans, deep state Republicans, warmongering Republicans, bullshit Republicans. And then the Democratic liberal interventionists, as well as the military industrial complex Eisenhower warned us about so prophetically, and most significantly, the point man of the Ukraine situation under the Obama administration, President Joe Biden and Biden's administration. That's the cabal here behind this war. That really is. That's the impetus, not Mr. Zelensky.
Yeah, I mean, the assumption seems to be that Putin, will be replaced by sort of like docile puppet-like person, there's someone who's subservient to American interests first, another sort of like Boris Yeltsin, I believe his name was. Like, it seems like that's what it's kind of akin to that.
Yeah, Boris Yeltsin, I think retrospectively was, alcoholic and a bit of a U.S. puppet who sold Russian oil interest on the cheap for many years and critically led to the collapse of the entire Russian economy in 1998, which set up Putin's rise to power. But Boris Yeltsin, I guess to his credit, depends how you look at it, he said, the one good thing I'll do is promote the one guy who believes most in Russia's future, and that was Vladimir Putin. So Boris Yeltsin did do that. I think he was sincere when he did that. So, but he was far, far from perfect from a Russian national perspective. As a U.S. puppet, he was pretty good. But, in the end of the day, you got to be careful what you wish for. Russia has more nuclear weapons than we do. They have more. Russia can level to the ground the United States in 30 minutes. Is this a country you want to create this kind of turmoil for? For what strategic objective?
Yeah, I mean, even looking more over than that, like if Putin were to be overturned, who would take his place? As you've already alluded to, who would actually do that at this point?
I mean, work it out in your mind. God forbid some little namby-pamby, or someone weaker than him who get pushed around by who God knows who, or some new drunkard like you referred to the first Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, or somebody who's more hardcore, an Andropov KGB guy who put Gorbachev in power, a Rambo who's dying to push every red button he sees. I think it's extremely imprudent, reckless, and negligent for the US to invoke regime change in a country like Russia when nukes are involved. You don't want to destabilize countries that have more nukes than you unless it's for one hell of a reason.
Yeah, I mean, dare I say, damn near suicidal, to put that much power in the hands of someone who could be even more tyrannical.
I mean, yeah, and you've alluded this a few times now, but whether or not eviscerating Russia's military has been the American plan from inception, from the outset, the policy is not surprising because it follows logically, predictably from an overarching Western narrative about Russia that's already been widely accepted by mainstream media. So this all flows organically.
I mean, yeah, I mean, by now it's well known Putin is an insatiable expansionist, who kind of lacks any plausible national security motivations for decisions. He can just kind of just do what he wants to do. But Putin, I mean, it's kind of akin to this. I'm not gonna say it's a one-to-one, but it is a little akin to sort of like Nazi tactics, little Hitler-esque, because the Russian move into Ukraine, it kind of looks very similar to like Nazis kind of moving into Poland and things of that nature. So it is very sort of World War II-esque in that regard.
I mean, I do think that's the mainstream narrative, but when you look underneath the curtain, things don't jive with that simplistic portrayal. I mean, the mainstream narrative portrays, additionally, any Western desire to compromise or negotiate a quick end of the conflict is wishful thinking and appeasement. Appeasement to who? The new Hitler. Ironically, the Russians fought Hitler. So, I think we've got to reassess that, but that is the Nazi analogy is the mainstream media view.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we look at the mainstream or Western narrative, specifically, about the Ukraine war, if that's correct, then our policies, they might arguably make sense the way we're kind of treating this particular, situation.
Yeah, even if they entail some risk of nuclear conflict, if that narrative were true, which it isn't, yes. And so there is an inner logic going on here. People need to be made aware of.
Yeah, I can see how that tracks. But there's always a but, but if the narrative is wrong, then the West is basing, existential decisions on false premises, which is, I think, pretty dangerous.
I mean, that started off this whole podcast. I told you that is my belief that the West is doing exactly that. And if the narrative is wrong, a quickly negotiated compromise, one that would spare the lives of combatant civilians alike, Russian and Ukrainian, and simultaneously greatly qualitatively reduce the risk of nuclear war, would not represent appeasement to Hitler. Rather, it would be a practical necessity, even a moral obligation. So my view is directly opposed to the mainstream media view.
Yeah, and just one more thing to kind of throw on top of that, if the Western narrative about Russia's motivation is wrong, if that's completely wrong, then the actions of the West, the ones that are taking right now, they're more likely, at least in my opinion, to deepen the crisis, to make it much, much worse and kind of pushing us more towards the likelihood, of nuclear war. Or am I wrong about that? That's just kind of how it kind of feels.
No. I believe the mainstream Western narrative is wrong. I believe it's the opposite of truth. And I believe what you're alluding to now is dead on the money. And I think the underlying cause of the war lies not in the unbridled expansionism of Vladimir Putin or in the paranoid delusions of military planners in the Kremlin. The cause of the war lies in a 30-year history of Western provocations directed at Russia that began during the dissolution of the Soviet Union and continued to the start of the Ukrainian-Russian war back in February.
That's a bit interesting there because, I know that I know a decent amount of Cold War stuff, World War I, World War II, how that all shook out and our tense relationship there. But I guess just take me through it real quick. Like what happened over that 30-ish year timeline from I believe it was 1992, until now. I guess that was so critical that it directly feeds into this conflict.
Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the former Soviet satellites, they aligned with NATO and started, in effect, move towards the West. The more Eastern Europe countries that join NATO, it looks like a march of NATO towards Russia. So NATO an alliance that was initially conceived to counter the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire, remaining after the collapse of the USSR, the Soviet Empire, that signal hostility to the new Russian Federation. I mean, their view is, we're not communist anymore. There's no Soviet Empire. We dissolved the Soviet Union peacefully. We didn't fight you guys. Why do you still have NATO? We let down our guns. Why aren't you putting down your guns? Instead, you're not only not putting down your guns, you're adding more countries that were formerly our friends into NATO, which the very heart of NATO is to destroy us. We're not communist anymore. Lay down your weapons, please.
Yeah, I've always thought that was pretty interesting. So I guess in your opinion, like if the Soviet Union was destroyed, which it was, like if that happened, so like why is NATO still there? Like what is the point of that?
Well, I think Putin and the Russian people asked the same freaking question. NATO was a defense alliance against the Soviet Empire, and it wasn't in existence anymore. But nonetheless, not only did the defensive alliance of NATO persist, but it increasingly became more offensive by adding more and more countries to the list. And those countries were directly getting closer and closer to Moscow, which I would think would be strategically offensive to the Russians.
I guess so. Is it safe to say that by, I guess, the year 2000-ish, somewhere in there, like Putin and Russia perceive the continued existence of NATO, like kind of like as an inherent threat to Russia? And I guess also I'm thinking about, I guess, more of a tactical denial of Russian influence in Eastern Europe.
Absolutely. I mean, the Russians were being precluded their Monroe Doctrine, their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, which they've had for well over 1,000 years, 5 times longer than the United States, 4 times longer than the United States even existed. But, I think Putin assumed a hostile stance against, the West, quite specifically NATO, was aimed at Russia. 2008, Russia invaded Georgia.
Yeah.
And based on a belief that the small Caucasus nation would join NATO, and NATO did say, Georgia and Ukraine were the next on the list, and he invaded Georgia, I believe, to preclude Georgia from entering NATO. And in that sense, his war was successful. That was my point. Go ahead.
Yeah, because I remember the Georgian conflict well, but I guess then, like, since about roughly the 2000, like Russia's foreign policy has been, it's entirely been predicated on countering NATO expansion.
So predicated, so organically, Russia would violently and staunchly oppose NATO expansion into Ukraine, which, to be very clear, is a historic part of the Russian Empire. The Ukrainians were the Cossacks. Russia comes from Kiev. Russia losing the Ukraine, Russia losing the Cossacks, Russia losing the Ukraine will be like us losing the 13 colonies. We come from the 13 colonies. When we're willing to let the 13 colonies go to China or Russia or another country, they'll be willing to let go of the Ukraine. So also the Ukraine is a source of warm water ports that they fought for in the Crimean War, Odessa, Sevastopol in the Crimean area. And it's a country directly bordering the Russian border. I mean, they're not going to let NATO missiles come that close to Moscow. It's not going to happen.
So any NATO flirtation, with the idea of Ukrainian membership would obviously be met with severe resistance, as I would think so. But the West has dragged Ukraine along this path, to catastrophe. Let's just call a spade a spade. We're seeing it right now playing out in real time.
Which is why, as a lot of people assume, this conflict did not begin in February 2022. And it is not simply a result of Putin suddenly going mad one day and saying, hey, let me piss off the world, antagonize NATO, and possibly start World War III and just decide to attack the Ukraine. The crisis began more accurately in 2014, though you could argue much earlier than that, and I will later on, but 2014 is a key precursor to where we're at, when Ukraine's pro-Russian government was overthrown in the Maidan movement. And the Maidan movement was a Western-backed series of riots in Ukraine's major cities funded by CIA, about $1 billion, which we'll get to later.
Yeah, my perception is that, I guess, that Ukraine, being so deeply divided between, European aligned and Ukrainian speaking West, and the Russian aligned, Russia speaking East. This is kind of like the way I've always kind of parsed it out when I'm looking at it.
Yeah, and the Maidan movement plunged this frail balance into utter chaos. The chaos, that balance you're talking to, and it's hard to keep track. But
yeah,
following the Maidan movement, Russia annexed Crimea. They're not going to lose. They fought the Crimean War over it. It's their port in the Black Sea. They're not going to lose that, no matter what. No matter what, it's not an option. And Russia already had bases there in order to protect their warm water ports. Russia's always been after warm water ports since Peter the Great, which is why Russia's allied with Syria, which is their other warm water port off the Syrian coast, so in the Mediterranean. Pro-Russia rebel movements sprang up in eastern Ukraine, and they did have extensive and direct Russian support, because that part of Russia, to be clear, the Donbass was added to the Ukraine by Khrushchev in the 1950s. So, and since everything was run by the Soviet Union, i.e. Moscow, who was in what Soviet republic was irrelevant. I believe Khrushchev would have never handed over the Donbass to the Ukraine if he ever thought it was going to become independent of Russia, not in a million years. So in Ukraine, he spent the next 8 years in a civil war, basically between the Ukrainian and Russian population since 2014. So there was already extremely destabilized, and the Russians felt the Russian people in Donbass were being persecuted and killed and murdered by neo-Nazi organizations, which our Congress also agreed in precluding funding to the Ukraine in those specific units, and they're named in the congressional record as being neo-Nazi and fascist. So our Congress would agree with Putin's assessment that there were neo-Nazi groups persecuting and murdering the Russians, native Russians in the Donbass.
So then I guess, because there's a lot there, but like, where does the West actually come into all that? That's a lot of conflict there, so I'm just kind of curious.
Following the U.S.-backed coup d'etat, the U.S. sent military equipment, advisors, and financial support to the Ukraine government. Essentially, the West was preparing Ukraine for the next great European war. The West routinely rewarded hardline stances against Russia, specifically discouraging any conciliatory stances towards Russia, any negotiated settlement. Furthermore, the prospect of Ukrainian NATO membership, while never guaranteed, was always in the subtext of these efforts. Article 5 mentioning will come to your defense, oral promises to the Ukraine. So that was always in play, giving, in my opinion, the Ukrainians a false sense of security in fighting the Russians. So I think there would have been a negotiated settlement had the U.S. not misled the Ukrainians in that regard.
So then I assume this terrified Russia right here that we got, since Ukraine is a country, on their border with deep historic ties to their state, and they're joining the West, would spell the end of Russian influence in Europe. And I suppose it would also pose an immediate security risk to the Russian heartland.
Well, you got to ask, where's the Russian heartland, Levi? To reiterate, to be clear, Russia was born from the Ukraine. The Cossacks have been with Russia and with the Tsar for many hundreds of years. So when you say the heartland is not Moscow. Moscow was only the capital of Russia since 1920. Before that, it was Petrograd, Leningrad, however you want to refer to it. So, when Russians think of the heartland, the breadbasket of Russia, many of them think of Kiev, the Ukraine, the Cossacks, that sort of region. So when you say the heartland, Americans perceive Russians' perception of the heartland as Moscow. Russians themselves would be a lot more broad about that heartland, and many of them would obviously include the Ukraine.
Yeah, and caught in the middle of this power struggle was Ukraine itself, who was now being set up for a war by the West against a very, cornered Russia, I would say.
And a cornered Russia, and still the Ukraine continued to take an increasingly hard line against Russia, to the tune of more American aid and the prospect of being accepted into the EU, the Western sphere, NATO, so on and so forth. So they were, in my opinion, being somewhat baited.
Yeah, so eventually, as the West and Ukraine, move closer, like Putin felt pressure to, he did invade, Ukraine, and just as he did Georgia. That's kind of how I think this kind of went down.
Yeah, I think that is how it went down. The West, seizing the opportunity to economically isolate and cripple Russia, has driven Russia to seek closer ties with China, Turkey, India. I mean, China, Russia, and India, historically, for thousands of years, have never gotten along. They couldn't agree on the time of day. But the Biden administration has single-handedly managed to create a de facto alliance between India, China, and Russia that already are working on destroying the US dollar as a world reserve, and are helping each other fight in the Ukraine. And to accomplish that in foreign policy, in my mind, is nothing short of treason from an American perspective. I mean, it would give anyone in the West a heart attack to see Russia, China, and India unified and in a de facto alliance. It's beyond belief. But Russia and China already right now, they're part of bilateral agreements of general cooperations that stand against the West, specifically America. I mean, they're not with our interests. In terms of foreign policy, to be clear, Russia and China, what's going on there is a nightmare, and it's made worse with India also wanting in on the alliance, and Modi, and I believe he is in on it. So we got a hellacious trifecta here for the United States, all coming into existence by Joe Biden's actions as vice president under the Obama administration, and now as president, all to the destruction of the Ukraine. And President Biden has been the key man on this since 2014, since being vice president. He's been the point man for the Ukraine since the Obama administration. So, and let's not forget, this is why Trump was impeached with Burisma, with Biden's son, Hunter Biden, on the Burisma board of directors, receiving money, and Hunter Biden's partner, and Trump not wanting to give military aid to Zelensky until he found out more about the corruption. Trump was impeached for making military aid contingent upon political favors when Trump was really trying to find out what the hell's going on. And Trump ended up giving the military aid anyway. He never did find out. And so this has been the key issue with Joe Biden. He is the deep state. I mean, he's their point man, and he's doing that. He's orchestrating all of it, or it's being orchestrated through him. That's probably a better way of saying it right now.
Well, whether or not, Ukraine holds out, that remains to be seen. But like, the scars of this war will doubtlessly persist for many generations, regardless of the victor. At least kind of how I view it. But your position is pretty clear, Mary. Like, Ukraine is the West's fault. There can be no denying that from where I'm looking at here, from what you're telling me. Because the West built a Ukraine designed, to kind of, stick it to Russia in this war, to kind of goad them, into war specifically.
Yeah. And recent evidence corroborating that is ex-West German Chancellor Angela Merkel admitting that the Minsk 1 and 2 agreement, specifically the Minsk 2 Accord, was so the Ukraine would have time for NATO military interoperability with the Ukraine, enabling the Ukraine to better fight Russia. So the Minsk agreements, we now know from Merkel, the ex-West German Chancellor, were just a lie to give time for the Ukraine to fight Russia with NATO material. Needless to say, the Russians are really, really pissed off about this recent revelation, which I think substantiates what you say I'm saying, and I am saying that.
Yeah, so like, I guess my next question would be like, what do you have in mind when you mentioned earlier of like Western provocations? Like, can you elaborate a bit more on that? Like, what specifically, like what?
All right, well, we went back to 2014. Now we got to go back, 3 decades if we're going to go on all of it. The U.S., sometimes alone, sometimes with its European allies, has done the following. One, expanded NATO over 1,000 miles eastward, over 1,000 miles since 1992, pushing it towards Russia's borders in disregard of massive, many verbal and written assurances previously given to Moscow that it wouldn't do exactly what it did do from 1992 to 2008. Next, I think another key provocation was the withdrawal unilaterally from the anti-ballistic missile treaty by the U.S. and placed anti-ballistic launch systems in newly joined NATO countries. Big no-no for Russia's perceiving of that. Why? These launchers can also accommodate and fire offensive nuclear weapons at Russia, like nuclear-tipped Tomahawk cruise missiles, and that helped lay the groundwork and may have directly instigated an armed far-right coup in the Ukraine. They may have felt secure enough to do their coup against the pro-Russian government and the Maidan movement because NATO was moving in with this type of weaponry all around them. So, but nonetheless, the coup replaced a democratically elected pro-Russian government with an unelected pro-Western one. So that's another provocation. Another one being, I would say, that Ukraine would become a member of NATO straight up. That's another provocation. NATO then refused to renounce this policy even when it would have averted war. I think if NATO would have said, we're not letting the Ukraine in, I don't think we're in the situation we're in today. So that's another provocation. Another one done by the U.S. and or its allies, withdrawn unilaterally from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, increasing Russian vulnerability to a U.S. first strike. That's another provocation. Another one would be armed and trained the Ukrainian military through bilateral agreements, and they held regular systemic joint military training exercises inside the Ukraine with NATO. That's a prep. That's a prep for what's going on now. Ukraine was prepped, was wired, was created to do what they're doing. And the Russians know this, and they're really pissed off about it. The goal has been to produce NATO-level military interoperability even before formally admitting Ukraine and NATO. That's a huge provocation. Last but not least, I think led the Ukrainian leadership to adopt that uncompromising stance I keep alluding to towards Russia, which to me further exacerbate the threat to Russia and putting Ukraine in the path of Russian military blowback, which you saw when Putin invaded in February. That was Russia saying, well, enough's enough, enough's enough.
All right, so there's a lot of this. Let me just parse this out in my brain a bit. So like, I guess to me, these provocations, with a country without nuclear weapons, like Iraq or Iran, that's one thing. That's one thing right there. Putting that away, but against a nation that has more nuclear weapons than we do, that's a pretty damn big concern. I mean, the specter of thermonuclear war just kind of lingering overwards, a war fought with hydrogen bombs, which would entail an existential threat to all countries involved. Let's just be real, as well as the humanity at large, is what must, it's what must remain at the forefront or the back, however you choose to put it, the back of someone's mind, when you discuss this war. That's just a possibility that definitely is there, so this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, all over again, gets a communism that exists not in Russia, but rather in China, with whom we do so much business with all the time. I think that's a fair comparison, historically speaking.
Yeah, I agree with the Cuban Missile Crisis analysis and analogy, but we got to go back and figure out how we got to where you just alluded to. So
all right, then so let's go back then. Let's go back to, I guess, the beginning of wherever that story begins.
All right. I would say 1990, when the Soviet Union was coming to an end, it begins. Western leaders sought to reunify Eastern and Western Germany, East and West Germany, under NATO's auspices. That's the first key incident.
All right, but didn't that require that Moscow agreed to remove, I think it was roughly like 30,000 or 300 or 400,000 troops from East Germany? I believe that's what it was.
Yeah. And that was a massive concession by Gorbachev. And to pull that off, the U.S. Embassy in Bonn informed Washington that West German Foreign Minister Heinz Dietrich Genzer made clear in a major public speech at Tutzing in Bavaria on German unification, and I quote, that the changes in Eastern Europe and the German unification process must not lead to an impairment of Soviet security interests. So therefore, NATO should rule out an, quote, expansion of its territory towards the east, moving it closer to Soviet borders, end quote. The Bonn cable also noted Genzer's proposal to leave the East German territory out of NATO military structures, even in a unified Germany and NATO. What that means is NATO could stay in West Germany once it was unified with East Germany, but no NATO troops or military equipment could move towards Russia by being placed in East Germany, even if it's a unified Germany. That's how clear the Russians said. And they said, based on that verbal promise, we're going to pull out 400,000 troops out of East Germany and allow Germany to reunify. These were the conditions. This was the deal.
So then by January 31st, 1990, looking at that time frame, Gorbachev was appeased by these assurances by the U.S. Embassy and the Western German foreign minister that not only was there going to be no NATO expansion, but that even in a unified Germany, NATO was not going to operate in what was the East Germany back then.
Yeah, and that people forget that, and so we're gonna put up for the viewers to see further documentation proving this, because it's a pretty strong argument here, in my opinion. And just look at this, NATO expansion. What Gorbachev heard. National Security Archive, George Washington University. There's the site. I hope our viewers will call it up on the internet and read it themselves. Don't take our word for it. So, Svetlana Savankaya and Tom Blanton from the National Security Archive, whose most recent book, The Last Superpower Summits, Gorbachev, Reagan, and the Bush, Conversations That Ended the Cold War, 2016, that also goes to this. It analyzes and publishes the declassified transcripts and related documents from all of Gorbachev's summits with US presidents, including dozens of assurances about protecting the USSR security interests. So I also give that to our viewers to look up and substantiate the assertions in this podcast right now. And I'd like to add that critically, to mollify Moscow, Western leaders communicated the view that NATO would not expand eastward toward Russia's border. Furthermore, according to an analysis by the National Security Archive of George Washington University, where the relevant declassified documents are posted, and I quote, a cascade of assurances about Soviet security were given by Western leaders to Gorbachev and other Soviet officials throughout the process of German unification in 1990 and into 1991, end quote. Keep in mind that these assurances pertain not only to the question of NATO's expansion in East Germany, but also to the expansion of NATO into the countries of Eastern Europe, which obviously would include the Ukraine. So we're back to the Ukraine.
Yeah, and to be clear, despite these assurances, within a few years, NATO began to expand towards Russia's border.
Yes, absolutely. Although the insurance, admittedly were not substantiated or written down in formal treaties, subsequent Soviet and Russian complaints about being misled about NATO expansion were not simply Russian propaganda, but they were it was based on written contemporaneous memoranda at the highest levels of Western government. This stuff wasn't being made up. And now we're going to put up for the viewer some hard proof of this to read at their leisure. Number one, West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher told Baker, Secretary of State Baker, on February 2nd, 1990, that under his plan, NATO would not extend its territorial coverage to the area of the GDR, nor anywhere else, get that, in Eastern Europe, end quote. Secretary of State to U.S. Embassy Bonn, this is the Baker-Genscher meeting, February 2nd. There's the proof. George H.W. Bush, Presidential Library, NSC, Cantor Files, box number, so on and so forth. So the viewers can look at this. This was also cited, just so you know, so it's been subsequently given credit and viewed respectfully in article, which is up there for you to view. Deal or No Deal, the end of the Cold War, and the U.S. offered to limit NATO expansion, international security, 2016. This viewpoint has been substantiated now for about 15 years, in the scholarly literature. So it's out there for anyone to look at. Number two, see memorandum. Look at the conversation between Gorbachev and John Major, British Prime Minister, published in Mikhail Gorbachev, Sobrany Sukanetti, the Moscow in 2014. Number three, NATO enlargement, assurances and misunderstandings. Number four, James Goldgear from American University wrote the authoritative book on the Clinton decision on NATO expansion, not whether, but when, and described the misleading U.S. assurances to Russian leader Boris Yeltsin, in a 2016 War on the Rocks article. So I just want the viewers to be aware, this is not coming out of nowhere. The Russian view is based on many, many instances from top Western leaders on promises, don't march NATO towards us and everything's fine. And we ignored that.
Yeah, given the magnitude of everything you just talked about, this misled the Russians on this very key matter. Do you have any other reputable sources in regards to this?
Yeah, a similar conclusion was reached by Joshua Shiffrinson in the Journal of International Security. Shiffrinson describes evidence that, and I quote, the United States misled the Soviet Union, end quote, and it violated the spirit of the negotiations, and that's deal or no deal, the end of the Cold War, and the U.S. offered to limit NATO expansion, putting that up for our viewers to see. Also, in an interview at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center, Shiffrinson described his archival research, and I quote, I was able to see simultaneously what was being told to the Soviets to their faces and what the U.S. was telling itself in the back room. Many of the Russians have repeatedly claimed that an informal non-expansion pledge was offered by the U.S. in 1990. And for the last 25 years, Western policymakers, at least in the U.S., have roundly said, quote, no, we didn't. And nothing was written down and it wasn't signed. So it doesn't matter if we did, end quote. And what I found in the archives was that the Russian narrative is basically exactly what happened. And there's the quote. I really hope our viewers will take the time to read it. Don't take my word for it. So you can see this podcast, is based on substantial, credible evidence. And I'd like to add that these documents reinforce former CIA Director Robert Gates' criticism of, and I quote, pressing ahead with expansion of NATO eastward in the 1990s when Gorbachev and others were led to believe that wouldn't happen, end quote. The key phrase buttressed by the documents is led to believe. This deception seems by now systemic to me, systemic. And the source here we're putting up with the quote. So any viewer can look at it and go check it out for themselves.
I mean, were these Western assurances legally binding in any capacity?